I am just going to move straight along on into introducing your first keynote today, which is Shannon Hogue, who is the Global Head of Solutions Engineering at Karat, who is speaking about hiring in hypergrowth, balancing delivery and scale.
Thank you so much, Emma. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Hogue, and I am the Global Head of Solutions Engineering at Karat. And for those of you who don't know me, my entrance into tech was anything but traditional. I didn't grow up around a major tech hub, nor did I attend a top-tier computer science school or any university, honestly, for that matter. So picture me, this young girl from Chicago in the 80s, upstairs in my bedroom, deconstructing and reconstructing my Atari console just for fun. And for all of you millennials watching, Atari was a thing before PlayStation and Nintendo. I promise it was awesome. And this was anything but normal for a girl at that time. And yet there I was, immersing myself in a hobby and hobbies that would later become my lifelong career. So while I was in high school, I taught myself how to code. And then after I graduated, I was offered a tech job that would pay me more money than my family had ever seen. And so I got into my Dodge Shadow, 87 Dodge Shadow, and I drove out to San Francisco from Chicago. And I started my career as a developer. I started writing software and did pretty well. You know, I was doing contract work for companies like Logitech and Excite at Home. And eventually I found myself doing management consulting, which I never thought was possible. And I'd go in and I'd take a look at architectures and figure out why companies who couldn't move their product forward were having trouble, right? And they were having trouble delivering. So maybe the product wasn't moving forward, maybe they had architects who had left, or maybe they just were hiring the wrong people. Whatever the issue was, they couldn't move their business forward. So I would go in, I'd do an assessment, I'd make some changes, maybe hire some developers. And it was really successful working with my mentor. And I finally, after some time, was offered a job, like my dream job. And I pretty much thought, and anyone in this room who's been a young developer can probably relate, that I was Superwoman. I did. You know, I was brought into a company by the CTO, Al Alcorn. And for those folks in the room who know Al, I'm probably dating myself with a reference, but it was a big deal for me. I mean, Al is the inventor of Pong, one of the original Atari games. So here I am in my mid-20s, early career, thinking I'm Superwoman, and I'm working for one of my heroes. And I should have been intimidated, but I wasn't because, of course, you know, I was Superwoman, right? So I dove right in. I brought in a new architect. I made changes. I mean, everything was written in Perl. We had terabytes and terabytes of data in the free version of MySQL. And we had bits in the database, and there were 8-hour outages or so many problems. I mean, we had 8 to 10 hour outages. And so I figured, you know what? This is an easy fix. I got this. Easy win. I'm going to impress my mentor. I'm good. So we fixed it. We did. We pulled the bits out of the database. We got better infrastructure. I bought $1 million blade systems. So, you know, of course, dating myself again. And we moved to modern languages. And we stopped writing things in Perl because even back then it was really difficult to find developers that could help you that wrote Perl. So fast forward a few months, everything is working better now. No more 8 to 10 hour outages. Our customers were happy, but the old architect and engineering leader kind of caught wind of what we were doing, and he wasn't happy. And he was friends with the CEO, and he was friends with Al, my hero. And so he goes to Al and he's like, hey, by the way, I know that you have this woman, you have all this work that's being done, but you know what? She's doing it wrong. And the company at the time, they put us in a room and they had us talk about what's going on. How did we build this software? How did we deliver it? What was the architecture? Why did we make these changes? Why did we pull the bits out of the free version of MySQL? And the very first question that was asked, which by the way, I thought we had this, but the very first question that Al asked us was, so you're saying it's faster. Show me the metrics, show me the measurements. My heart sank. I had nothing at the time. I mean, I had no monitoring or metrics or measurement in place. We were just going and going and going and trying to fix the problem. And whatever office politics that may have been in play, it didn't matter. All of my team's great work didn't matter, right? And I didn't have what I needed. I failed me. I failed me. I failed my team. I failed their work. I failed my chance to build an incredible relationship with somebody that I looked up to my entire life. So I left, and I left thinking that I needed to do something different. And honestly, I just started prioritizing monitoring, working at companies like New Relic and Epsagon, and making monitoring and optimization the next step in my career. So I did. I worked my way back up to engineering leadership, and I kept building teams, and I even tackled my team structure and organization like I would with architecture as a consultant. I was always trying to optimize every piece of it to make sure that we were able to hit delivery and deployment targets ahead of schedule. But the more that my teams delivered, in a great way, and the faster that we grew, the harder it was to balance the growth, especially with interviewing. So interviewing for growth essentially was cannibalizing my team's ability to deliver. And then I came across Karat. So a little bit of a backstory, and I really do promise that this is not a Karat infomercial, but I do have to give a little bit of context around Karat in order to continue. Our co-founders, Jeff and Mo, were trying to find a way to unlock opportunities by improving the broken hiring process. Mo was actually dealing with the same problems that I was. And as an executive on the Xbox team, he couldn't find enough engineering time to conduct the interviews he needed to hit his hiring targets. So it turns out, and hopefully some of you relate, but it turns out that this is a problem that probably many of you in this virtual place can relate to, especially if you're a fast-growing company. It can be a full-time job just to keep up with all the interviews your team is requiring. I'm sure folks in this virtual room have seen examples of this firsthand. How many times have all of you as leaders had to go and poke someone on the shoulder? Hey, by the way, I know you've been up for 2 days trying to fix this bug and get something out the door for me, but I need you to go ahead and interview. So I'm sure that you've seen examples of this firsthand. But making your team spend their time interviewing as opposed to delivering code, it's a huge drain, both from a financial and a morale standpoint. And this is something that we have heard loudly from the majority of engineering leaders we surveyed in the last year. The problem is a lot of organizations are just flat out bad at interviewing. Without consistent, high quality interviews, it's impossible for leaders to identify sources of bias in their process, which is more important than ever as businesses are continuing to make commitments around building more inclusive teams. And it's not just limited to engineering teams. Interviewing is a problem everywhere because it isn't anyone's job. So that's what Karat helps solve, right? And that's why I joined the team as the head of solutions engineering. That or the fact that I had another chance to do right by another gaming console vet and I had to jump on it. All right, so Karat, just quickly, we conduct interviews on behalf of companies hiring software engineers, and we help teams or optimize their hiring process so that they can save engineering time and hit delivery targets. And it's my job to make sure that every technical interview that we conduct is aligned to the right job description and hiring bar, and to make sure that those interviews are predictive, fair, and enjoyable, of course. Now, this is kind of a dream job for me because as a woman from a non-traditional tech background, I've had my share of horror stories. I honestly can't say how many opportunities that I've missed because I don't have a top 10 computer science school in my resume, but I can say that I've experienced interviewers walk into the interview and say, oh, and they look at my resume And they say, oh, you know what? I'm sorry, I must be in the wrong room. Or even had a candidate at some point ask me out. So working for a company that's trying to make hiring more efficient and equitable is something that really speaks to me at a personal level. And essentially, I'm doing the same kind of consulting that I was for architecture and infrastructure, but now I'm focusing on building teams, unlocking opportunity. And today, what I'm going to share is what I've learned from doing over 80,000 technical interviews. And how you can apply that to make your own processes more efficient to keep your developers delivering during crunch time. And of course, I will make damn sure that you know how to walk away being able to monitor and measure that. All right, so like any good engineer, I like to break the problem down into its component parts. And these are the 6 stages of the process that you as engineering leaders actually have control over. We're not talking about recruiting or sourcing or even final offer packages. This is about where your team is spending their time instead of delivering product and how they can get more efficient and effective. Now, the 6 steps are defining hiring competencies that set your job descriptions up for success by clearly communicating what's expected of candidates. Developing interview questions that reduce bias and noise while giving you the best hiring signal. Training your interviewers to conduct the interviews professionally and put candidates at ease. Measuring the candidate performance consistently, using structured rubrics, and establishing a clear hiring bar and analyzing the hiring data to optimize your approach. So, like I said, the first step is the job analysis and creating a list of relevant competencies. It means that for each job, someone needs to review the job description, the responsibilities, and any existing assessments to determine for the role the competencies. For a typical engineer role, this could include basic coding, algorithms, or even talking through a code review. Now, having a formal competency framework, it lets you evaluate each competency intentionally. Don't try to measure multiple competencies at once, and test your questions to make sure you're actually measuring what you think you are. Now, does your candidate need to be able to speed read 4 pages of English to be able to be successful on the job? By the way, seriously, an old colleague of mine had an interview where he was handed a 4-page packet to read. He was asked to produce a spec and fully working code at the end of the meeting. And I'm not sure if that's actually how they worked internally, but I wouldn't know because he didn't get the job. But it definitely didn't produce any reasonable hiring signal about his coding ability. Now, another consideration, does every candidate know the rules of the same board games as you? If not, does your question put someone at a disadvantage? I mean, if you're asking them to recreate a game and they're not familiar, it's not fair, right? So those are important questions, but most importantly, for hiring efficiency is to be clear with the criteria and the competencies that you're testing. If you want to see a candidate test their code, ask them how they would test a given piece of code. Seems simple, right? I mean, are you expecting complete code or are you expecting an outline? Is a brute force solution good enough? Or, should the candidate start optimizing? Ask yourself these questions and be clear with your candidates, and that will ensure that your interviews are predictive and fair. And it also ensures that you're not wasting time with candidates instead of delivering, who are doing their best to demonstrate skills that you actually don't care about or need. Okay. Now, once you've settled on what you're measuring, you can start to optimize your interview format and questions. We'll talk about a couple of ways that you can do that. And ultimately, having the right questions will get you the most signal per minute, which keeps your engineers out of bad loops and delivering on your product roadmap, which we all need. Now, adding structure to your interview questions increases the signal that they produce while reducing the potential bias of each question. A common interview question format goes like this. Take a system like tinyURL or Uber and draw a diagram on the board. I know it is a cliche, but we see this all of the time. But the problem is that not all candidates understand the definition of boxes and lines in a typical whiteboard interview. And in fact, these are examples of questions that a candidate from MIT or Caltech may have learned, but somebody from a code academy like myself who's trying to change their lives, they don't actually have the same context, even if they understand and are adept at system design. So making assumptions about what somebody should have learned puts up barriers to entry, and it makes it harder to predict who actually has the right skill set or the skill set that you need to deliver. Now, our format for system design at Karat is to propose a simple, concrete system and ask the candidate to criticize aspects of its behavior. This sets clear expectations, and it narrows down the possible answers so it's easier to evaluate. Now, it's also important to understand how your question progression can skew results. Here's an example of a seemingly ordinary multi-part interview question. As an introductory question, you ask a candidate to find the most common letter in a sentence. Pretty straightforward, right? As a follow-up, though, you ask the most common letter in a sentence A that does not appear in sentence B. Now, this slide shows that two solutions with roughly equal merit exist, but there's no compelling reason to choose one or the other, right? Except when you get to question 2. The candidate who chose solution B has a head start over the candidate who chose solution A. I get that this example may seem contrived, but in practice, we've actually found that many multi-part questions exhibit surprising behaviors like this. So how do you fix it? Well, make sure that you're using questions that are conceptually linked, but don't share implementation code, or otherwise you risk needless false negatives. So yeah, sure. Look, it takes time to get this right, but every false negative is an extra interview loop in your engineering time that has to go to making a hire versus building software. Right. So once you've standardized on your questions and formats, the interviewers themselves are the biggest variable. You have a limited view into what actually happens once you close the door to that interview. And so how can you ensure that your interviews are consistent? Well, first you have to control how you select your interviewers. Do you interview them? Why do you pick people for interview loops? Is it because they have great soft skills and put candidates at ease? Or is it based on whoever has an open time block that you poked on the shoulder on their calendar that week? The next tip is especially relevant in a remote world, but record and review your interviewers. Make it a core competency for hiring managers. Honestly, put it on their performance reviews. If you don't put something on a performance review, it's never going to be treated like a core professional competency. I know for a fact that I was never trained or formally measured on my ability to interview or the efficacy of my interviews. So at Karat, we track and record all of our interview engineers. And unsurprisingly, we found that the number of errors that an interviewer makes actually decreases as they gain experience. So just like anything else, engineers get better at interviewing with practice, but too often interviewers are chosen based on who has free time or is willing and not based on experience. So now that you've ensured the interview is being consistently administered, how do we bring that consistency to the scoring system? Now, believe it or not, I've seen companies that have literally 40 possible grades between yes and no, and where performance data had to be aggregated for every single interviewer just to make a meaningful, a meaningful decision. So it's not a helpful pattern, and it's not something that you can monitor and track. And even if you have the best interview process in the world, if someone looks behind the curtain and asks you to defend your decision, you run at the risk of ending up like I did in front of my idol, Al Alcorn, with an indefensible program with no data, or worse, bad data. All right, so if you take one thing away from today. Please, 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 I'm begging you, please use a structured rubric, even if it's basic. The act of filling out a structured rubric will force your interviewers to validate their bias. And with a structured rubric, each evaluation is backed by a rigorous definition that you can audit and you can defend. Now, once you've defined these scoring standards and are collecting structured interview data, you can take a step back and ask yourself two questions. One, how does each interview perform in terms of producing a reliable hiring signal? And how does that hiring signal compare to your overall hiring bar? Now, much like an unstructured interview, roundtables, debriefs, hiring committees, they can quickly devolve into a black box. If you aren't documenting your hiring decisions and standards, you'll never be able to audit your hiring process. And if you're not analyzing your hiring decisions, you can't optimize the interview. So, for instance, do you know what happened to the candidates that you rejected? If your rejected candidates are all getting snatched up by competitors or even worse, companies that you assumed had a higher hiring bar, then you're probably optimizing your interviews for the wrong things. There's very few areas of your business where you would ignore the value of structured data, but a scary number of companies I talk to, they can't answer basic questions about their hiring funnel, which makes it impossible to evolve their approach. All right, I'll say it again, monitor and measure, monitor and measure. In our survey that I mentioned earlier, measurement was one of the biggest differentiators between leaders who were satisfied with their software engineers and ones who were potentially less satisfied. But, what should you be tracking? Well, there are 3 metrics that you can start monitoring right now. Now, the first is your on-site to offer ratio, the number of candidates that came on site compared to the number who ended up getting offers. On-site interview loops or final virtual interview loops these days are the most costly and time-draining step in your cycle. You have 4 to 5 members of your team, spending an hour with each candidate and another 10 to 15 minutes writing up their results, not to mention the roundtable. I mean, that's a day of lost delivery time for every single candidate that you invite on site or virtually on site. If your ratio is higher than 5 to 1, it's time to start reviewing your reasons for rejecting candidates to identify competencies that aren't being assessed properly early on. The second metric that you should be tracking is the drop-off rate by stage. Are you losing candidates at your code test? I mean, if it's a take-home assignment that takes more than an hour, we're going to bet that you are. Are there specific hiring managers who have higher drop-off rates? Are your drop-off rates for women worse, or even worse for underrepresented minority candidates? These all could be signals that you need interviewer training to keep an efficient and inclusive process. All right, finally, close rates. What percentage of candidates that you make an offer to actually accept? One way to improve close rates is actually to improve your efficiency at every single stage. There's a direct correlation between the time and process and close rates. The more interview loops that a candidate is in, the harder they are to close. I mean, move quickly and you'll have a better chance, especially as the entire industry ramps up hiring after 2020. I mean, if you're taking 3 months and 15 interviews to get through a cycle, it's going to be hard to hire once the candidates make it through. So hopefully some of the tips in the previous sections will help you gain more confidence in your hiring signal so that it's less of a problem. These 3 metrics are so meaningful when it comes to the efficiency of your team's time, which is absolutely essential in hypergrowth delivery mode. All right, so there are 5 takeaways that you can bring to your own hiring process right away. First, give interviewing an owner. By assigning an engineer to optimize each part of the interview, you create an accountability for the consistency of that section. Second, centralized interviewing and training. Inconsistent interviews are a danger to your business. Don't just train on the general guidelines of interviewing. Train interviewers on the specific questions they will ask and make sure that you have consistent standards. Third, find a way to audit your interviews. Even if you can't record interviews as we do, just use shadows, analyze metadata, and give feedback to non-predictive interviewers or those who don't follow a structure. Make sure to audit your team's questions and throw away the bad ones. And fourth, build your process for data collection from day one. If you build structure into the process from the ground floor, you'll be able to optimize, react quickly, and reduce the time that you waste on unproductive interviews and interviewing the wrong candidates. And fifth, if you do anything, hopefully you will learn from my early career superwoman arrogant programmer mistakes. Please measure your hiring efficiency so that you can track your process improvements and unlock opportunity for folks just like me who have non-traditional backgrounds and unlock opportunity for underrepresented communities. Thank you so much for having me.